Spoilers for the Wednesday, February 18th episode of Beyond the Gates focus on Tomas questioning Haley, Randy being handed a new assignment, and Donnie challenging Nicole to confront her real feelings about the men in her life. Key points to remember. Tomas has some questions for Haley. Randy's new assignment could expose a dangerous conspiracy. Donnie pushes Nicole to face her true feelings about the men in her life. Tomas has started to feel as if he's walking on a thin sheet of glass so transparent that everything underneath shows through in hazy outlines, yet never clearly enough for him to grip with certainty. The first time he heard Haley's voice through a half-closed door lowered, measured, with unusually long pauses between sentences, he assumed it was simply a personal call. A familiar kind of secret people don't want carried into the office. But when words like insurance, report, right timing, and to syllables that seemed to blur as Haley tried to swallow them back reached his ears, he knew he had brushed up against something far more dangerous. He didn't tell Bill not because he felt loyal to Haley, but because another, deeper reflex kicked in. He didn't want to become an unwitting pawn in a war waged by people richer and more powerful than he was. Bill was the boss, the man who could crush Tomas's career with a single decision. But Haley was the boss's wife, apparently the weaker link. Yet also a possible doorway into a secret network Tomas had not fully seen. Staying silent meant he still had choices. It gave him space to watch, to weigh where his loyalty belonged or whether it was worth being loyal to any of them at all. When Lynette entered the picture, everything suddenly arranged itself into a chain too coherent to ignore. Haley, who usually handled things with care but kept a professional, sensible distance, personally delivered pro bono defense paperwork to Lynette instead of sending it through internal dispatch. She sat with Lynette longer than necessary, her eyes lit with a nameless urgency, as if the two of them shared a private truth no one else could interpret. Tomas wasn't suspicious by nature, but he'd lived long enough to understand that dedication is rarely free in a world where everything is labeled in terms of advantage. He began stitching together the scattered details, the earlier cryptic call, the way Haley took Lynette's hand in the hallway, the quick looks they exchanged when Bill's name came up. When Tomas shared his observations with Carolyn, they didn't talk about Haley's kindness, they talked about darker possibilities, an insurance scam, some kind of staging, or worse, a plan designed to manipulate the very man who was paying all of them. That exchange with Carolyn became the spark for a decision Tomas had delayed for too long. He no longer wanted to wait for clues to fall randomly into his lap. When Haley appeared in the hallway, still holding Lynette's file, he stepped in and blocked her path, his voice calm, his questions sharp, yet still wrapped in the polite veneer of a young colleague. Tomas thought he was controlling the situation, but what he didn't know was that on the other side of the glass wall, Bill had paused long enough to catch fragments, words like why, robbery, paperwork, and Lynette, her name landing in Bill's memory like a splinter. Bill didn't hear the full exchange, but he heard enough to realize they were talking about something that should have been known only to him, Haley, and Lynette. The anger that had been smoldering since the day the staged robbery happened suddenly flared like fire catching on an oil stain. Bill had hidden part of the truth about that night, partly to protect his own image, partly to protect the woman he believed was the victim. Now he began to suspect that he might be the one being led by the nose. In that moment, standing still in the shadows, Bill was torn between two instinctive reactions. Part of him wanted to surge forward and throw Tomas's questions back in his face for the sheer audacity of doubting his wife and a client Bill believed needed protection. The other part, colder, sharper, forced him to step back, because a man who had built and run an empire understood the power of information. If he revealed he'd been eavesdropping, he would expose weakness. He would admit that he didn't fully trust the story he'd been told, either. So he chose silence. He let Tomas keep talking. He gave Haley room to react. And he trained himself to absorb every nuance in their voices and eyes, like a prosecutor seated in an invisible interrogation room waiting for one wrong note that could tilt the entire case. Bill's decision to ask Joey for help didn't come from sudden impulse, it came from nights of insomnia he couldn't confess to anyone. The Dupree family had lived in chaos and scandal long enough to know how to turn any tragedy into a media weapon. Bill couldn't bear the thought of his own story becoming another bite-sized piece in their banquet of rumors. Joey, on the other hand, solved problems differently, coldly, methodically, and, if needed, ruthlessly. Choosing Joey over the Duprees wasn't merely a tactical choice, it was a quiet statement that Bill didn't fully trust the family, the old ties, the friendships, and even the enemies that kept circling him. He wanted a discreet solution, but deep down he wanted something else too, a reverse test. If Joey uncovered proof that Lynette and Haley staged the robbery, Bill would finally understand what kind of woman he was living with, and someone else would get their hands dirty for him. Joey wasn't easily manipulated. The moment Bill started recounting the robbery details, Joey smelled the outline of a hastily written script. The robber's timing, the conveniently camera-thin location, the way Haley reacted frightened enough to be believable. But not so shattered that she lost control triggered instincts Joey had once used negotiating with con artists. He immediately sensed gaps, strange missing pieces, details Bill delivered with the faintest hesitation. That wasn't the voice of an entirely innocent victim. It was the voice of someone selecting which fragments of truth were allowed to surface. Joey didn't say that out loud, but he remembered it, and from there, Randy's assignment was born as a test with multiple layers. Randy accepted the assignment with a strained smile he couldn't fully hide. Joey wanted him to recheck the camera system, comb through phone logs, and quietly keep an eye on Lynette. On paper, it sounded like simple information hygiene, cleaning up whatever remained from the robbery to strengthen Bill's narrative. But to Randy, every instruction felt like a tightening rope around his neck. He knew there had been no robber. He'd helped edit the footage, knew exactly where the timestamps had been trimmed, and understood that if someone patient enough stitched the fragments together, the truth would rise. He owed Haley and Lynette, or at least he'd forced himself to believe he did. He told himself he was helping them, helping a woman get compensated, helping a friend avoid sinking deeper into violence. But now, with Joey watching, the line between loyalty and survival blurred. If Randy did the job properly, he would expose himself. If he did it poorly, he would trigger Joey's suspicion, and once someone like Joey suspected you, the path to survival almost always disappeared. As Randy struggled to blur the traces without being obvious, Joey quietly observed, using Randy's discomfort as a signal. He didn't believe in coincidences, and he believed even less in pure goodness. In Fairmont, Crest, a staged robbery, if it truly was staged, rarely served only one purpose. It could be a way for a woman to prove victimhood and tighten her hold on a rich man. It could be a tool to activate insurance funds, compensation, public sympathy inside a marriage already rotting from within. But Joey's mind went further. If two people shared a secret, a third would inevitably find a way to exploit it. A call Tomas overheard by accident might not merely hint at staging, it might be a shard of a much larger game, one where Bill himself wasn't entirely innocent. While those links slowly tightened, Donnie was opening another battlefield, one that looked softer on the surface, but was no less sharp beneath it. Donnie had always been the kind of woman who preferred to share, to turn private pain into a collective story, as if controlling the narrative could control the fear of being left behind. When she saw Nicole regaining her footing after the divorce from Ted, yet keeping her heart locked shut, Donnie couldn't tolerate the silence. She didn't just want to be a friend, she wanted to be a guide. Someone who could redefine Nicole's life through questions and emotional exercises disguised as care. In Donnie's eyes, Nicole avoiding talk of her sex life wasn't only a symptom of trauma. It was passive resistance, a refusal to face the possibility that she still cared about Ted, or worse, that she no longer knew where her heart belonged between Carlton, who represented stability, and Keel, who represented passion and danger. Donnie may have heard things about Ted that Nicole never did, backstage conversations, half confessions spoken while Ted was drunk, or while he believed he was speaking to someone irrelevant. Donnie carried those fragments like blades, not to cut but to peel away her friend's defenses. What she presented as emotional exercises were really loyalty tests, How would Nicole react when forced to choose, when cornered by the question of who she truly wanted beside her? And what fear was powerful enough to make her choose silence over truth? Donnie told herself she was helping Nicole heal, yet underneath that was another motive. She needed to be sure Nicole wouldn't return to Ted, wouldn't repeat the old cycle, wouldn't drag the entire friend group back into the swamp of parties, fights, and carefully staged avoidance that Donnie was exhausted from surviving. At the very least, if Nicole chose Carlton or Keel, it would be a new path, a different tragedy Donnie could analyze, manage, and shape into a story she could control. Nicole, meanwhile, felt like an object pulled in multiple directions by the gravity of men and expectations. She didn't want to talk about Ted, not only because she still loved him, but because that love had turned toxic, mixed with failure, humiliation, and fear. Carlton offered her a vision of safety, dinners on time, promises of a planned life, a steady shoulder that didn't change. Keel pulled her toward an older version of herself, the woman who dared to risk everything, who loved with full force, who allowed her world to flip upside down over a single handhold. Nicole didn't trust herself to choose passion again, but she also didn't know whether stability was truly what she wanted, or only armor she wore to prove to the world that she had moved on. In that context, every question from Donnie, every push to speak her feelings out loud, felt like a needle stabbing into the fragile shell Nicole had spent months building. She knew Donnie meant well, but that good intention was driving her toward an edge where one wrong choice could cost her even her sense of who she was. If Ted knew how deeply Donnie was interfering, he might respond with rage or with a counter-campaign of seduction, because Ted wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat in silence. He had once controlled Nicole with his presence, his power, by convincing her that no one understood her better than he did, that no one loved her enough to endure her darkness the way he did. Donnie's interference threatened to destroy that myth, threatened to steal from him the role of the only man allowed to save Nicole. And if Donnie accidentally pushed Nicole to choose too fast, choosing someone not out of genuine feeling, but out of the need to prove she had changed, the result could be a chain of regrets, leaving all three trapped in a bitter game of blame about who pushed whom onto a path with no way back. In another corner of Fairmont Crest, Ashley faced a different question, equally obsessive in its own way. Could she trust the man who had just left her in the middle of intimacy because of a call about his mother? Grayson repeated the same story about the nursing home, about his mother falling, about a son's responsibility. Every detail was identical, every retelling like a copied transcript, no additions, no omissions. To some, that consistency might signal truth, but in Ashley's mind, memories of investigations cases where liars clung to rigid scripts so they wouldn't accidentally reveal a crack wouldn't let her rest. Ashley was the kind of woman who stood up from rubble on her own, so she didn't easily trust men who appeared at the perfect moment and disappeared at the perfect excuse. Her competence, her ability to connect dots alone, seemed to irritate Grayson, as if each time she investigated, each time she linked details, she tugged harder at the curtain he'd drawn across his past. Derek had long carried a bad feeling about Grayson. Not simple jealousy, but recognition, because he had seen this type too many times in cases he'd handled. A man who looked kind, who carried a tragic family story like a shield, but never allowed anyone to glimpse the filth he buried in the dark. If Derek had something specific, it might be fragments from old sources, a name that once appeared in a file, unusual money movement, a shadowy connection to men like Joey. Perhaps he hadn't spoken up not because he didn't want to protect Ashley, but because he knew once the truth surfaced, it wouldn't only expose Grayson, it would drag other secrets from the Fairmont Crest network into the light as well. In a place where everyone has something to hide, accusing one person is rarely simple. It is a choice of sides, a declaration of loyalty, and sometimes a one-way ticket into direct confrontation with people powerful enough to erase someone else's life. All these threats: Tomas doubting Haley, Bill listening in silence, Joey sensing fabrication, Randy being forced to choose between survival and loyalty, Donnie tearing open Nicole's inner life, Ted waiting outside like a storm ready to break. Ashley, realizing Grayson may not be who he claims, are stretching the atmosphere of Fairmont Crest until it feels ready to snap. One confession, one stray camera clip floating back to the surface, one phone call overheard by the wrong person, and everything could explode. And the most frightening part is not who will be exposed first, but that once the truth begins to spill, it won't stop with one person. It will sweep up name after name, crushing the boundary between victim and accomplice, between the deceived and those who use deception itself to survive one more day.